Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome again to Procrastinator's Pit Stop. We have with us another amazing guest for you today. We have with us Mr. George Haymaker. George, once successful entrepreneur, suffered from anxiety, low self-esteem, anger, and addiction so severe it led to consuming up to 50 pain pills and 2 bottles of vodka daily by age 50. After discovering neuroplasticity's potential to rewire the brain, he transformed his life and now uses his certifications in solutions-focused and transformational neuroscience coaching plus nutrition science, to guide others toward breaking destructive patterns and realizing meaningful personal change. George, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Chris. Great to be here. Great to be alive.
And we're happy to have you here, George, and we're going to dig into a lot of interesting topics in just a moment. But before we do like to have an icebreaker on the show. And the question for you today was, which cartoon character do you resonate with the most and why?
Well, I'm going to go with Shrek, given the obvious personal resemblance or physical resemblance. Shrek was an interesting character. He had a lot of similarities in his journey as I've had in mine, and involves, having to change perspectives on things, showing resilience, perseverance. So that's kind of been the story of my life as well as many other people's, and it certainly was Shrek.
I like that. And, it's true that, there's so many facets to Shrek. He always used to say he was an onion, right? Keep peeling back those layers.
Yeah. I think there's just so much more to us and more capability that we all have if we really discover ourselves, really do a little in-depth work. I had to, I hit a hard wall partway through my journey with addiction. And so I needed to not just peel a few layers back, but all of them. And, the question is, do we have to hit that hard wall before we start peeling back some layers and figuring out what else is there? And, if we're not happy with where we are or what's happening in our lives, we can change and we can move to something different, which, requires, like you say, peeling back some layers and figuring out how to.
No, absolutely. On that sort of segue, why don't we get into your journey? Why don't you tell us a little bit about that and how you got to be where you are today?
Yeah, happy to. So it starts in childhood, as most people's journeys do, and the reason I start there is because it's really where the foundations are set in our lives, how our brains begin to form. And in my case, I was an uncomfortable child growing up. My upbringing was privileged in many ways. I didn't really want for anything, but it was also unsettling, kind of the way things had transpired. My father moved a lot with his career, so I was constantly in and out of different school environments, different homes. I went away to boarding school in ninth grade because they moved to Australia. So there was a lot of fending for myself, constantly changing environments, having to reestablish myself in new ones. It just made me uncomfortable in my own skin. There was a lot of physical discipline in our home, which obviously gives the message that, you're not okay the way you are. It was, kind of the way that kids were brought up in those days. That was the form of how you raised kids, how you showed them the difference between right and wrong. Well, as we know today, that has repercussions. And there were some other things that went on that contributed to my discomfort. So by the time I got to college, I was lacking in confidence, self-esteem, had a lot of anxiety. And we had a lot of addiction in our family. And, in college, I found drugs and alcohol, and it, I coped that way with my symptoms for many, many years, better part of 3 decades. And, I brought a lot of those mental discomforts with me into adulthood that resulted in behaviors that were not helpful to me or those around me. Had a lot of anger issues, a lot of defensiveness. I perceived things to be threats that weren't really threats. And that's just kind of how I ran my life. Being an entrepreneur for 3 decades, I was in a stressful line of work, and that just exacerbated what was going on in my mind and in my behavior. It's kind of like pouring gasoline on a fire. Addiction got out of control, and it's progressive disease. And by the time I was 50, as you say, I was taking a lot of pain pills and drinking a lot of booze, and it was ugly. I tried to kill myself, and that didn't work fortunately. And so I entered rehab, and I was sitting there in rehab, and I remember it to this day. Asking myself, how the hell did I get here? I was 50 years old, and my life had gotten out of control, and I just could not stop using drugs and alcohol. And I asked myself, I said, is this the way I'm going to go out? And I just refused to let that be the case. I just did not want to have this be my life. So that little voice inside me said, pick yourself up and figure out how to get through this. Fortunately, with all that moving and all the entrepreneurialism and all the setbacks that go along with that, I developed a pretty good ability to pivot and be resilient, pick myself up. So that's what I did. And I became fascinated with what had happened to my brain. Like, why was it that I was thinking and feeling the way I was, and why was that resulting in the behavior that it was, and why did I become an addict? And so it led me into the brain, because the brain is the place where all this resides in a physical nature, and our mind sits on top of our brain. So the good thing that I realized is that the brain can change. It changes every day anyway, and we can partner with it and cause it to change in the ways that we want, that will represent a way of life that is better for us, has more meaning, has more purpose, is healthier. And so that began a journey over the last 12 years. I've done a ton of research about the brain. I've taken, in the last few years, I've taken a bunch of advanced coursework, not only in neuroscience, but in coaching. And so I reached a point where I decided that operating businesses was no longer what I wanted to do, and I wanted to help others. Helping others gives me a lot of satisfaction, and I've learned so much about, and my change has been so instrumental in my own life, that I wanted to offer that to others. And so that's where I am today. I help people that are struggling and stuck, that aren't happy with what's going on in their mental and behavioral lives, and they want to find a different way. And so I help them through that process. There's a lot of education that goes on about the brain and how they can create change in their brains, because that is what is required in order for us to experience new experiences. The brain has to change. And so I take these people through journeys. We work together and find out what is meaningful to them. What futures do they envision for themselves? And then we start down that path of making that vision a reality.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. It's quite a roller coaster there, it goes back. I mean, as you said, it started early, and it's I guess it's why people who are probably more learned, more experienced, that they say that kids really need some sort of stability, because that's how you create an identity, right? And obviously, you need that footing there. So many challenges there, and you've overcome so much. What do you think was the biggest challenge you had to overcome?
So I really, I think it was probably my identity, just being so uncertain of myself. Like, was I good enough? I just remember so many times in my adulthood, anytime people would offer something alternative, even if just an exchange of ideas, I would see that as a threat. Like, it's not a threat. It's additional information. It's another idea. It's another way of approaching something. So I had these deeply embedded thought patterns, emotional patterns, that were all formed off these early childhood experiences. And that is actually what our personalities are. When you sit with yourself at any point in time and really take a hard look at who you are, it is the compilation of all of your past experiences. So your brain is just a record, a filing cabinet of everything that you've experienced in your life. And so that's really, all those experiences had contributed to me being really uncomfortable, having these really unhelpful thought and emotional patterns that bled out into behavior that just didn't serve me well. And so it was this overcoming that. I had to create a bunch of new experiences that were positive that would then form new neural architecture in my brain that my brain would then use to further even more new experiences. And so we can get into that a little bit if you want about how the brain predicts how we experience things, because the brain is a prediction machine, kind of a tangent, but that's really what this involves, is laying new experiences into your brain so it can use those as templates to predict new and more helpful experiences in the future.
You touched on something really interesting there. You said that you need to sort of create new positive experiences in order to overlay the groundwork of the negative ones. But for us to do that, just from an evolutionary standpoint, we are hardwired to go to the negative because the negative used to kill us. One of the reasons we are so dead set on the negative. Now, I'm curious because you said that we restructure the brain. Now, we know the brain is a bunch of chemicals, and we know that it restructures itself based on it can restructure itself based on drug use, depression, anxiety. We know this. So my question to you is this: do we need to have the physical experience to institute those sort of changes, or can it be as simple as visualization? And with that, so the dreams and nightmares have that same effect as the actual experience.
The brain doesn't know any difference between the virtual experience and the physical experience. So that's why when I'm working with someone, we start with a bunch of visualization about what that new life, that preferred life might look like. And it's really important to tie it to that person's psychological needs, their values systems, what they feel is most important to them at the most core level, their belief systems, so that this new life is tethered to the roots, that the foundation of who they are as a person and what they want to be, because that is the deepest level of motivation that there is living the life according to how you're built. So we do a lot of this visualization, and that very process begins the process of building these new neural pathways. So every thought, feeling, behavior that you enact or experience is represented by these groupings of neurons. They connect to one another and involve different parts of the brain involved in that particular feeling, thought, or behavior. And so, if we're at a point where we have some things that are occurring that aren't helpful, unfortunately, there are neural pathways that have been put into the brain and probably strengthened over time through recurring neurotransmission, meaning electrical and chemical signals traveling through them, and they go stronger like roots in a plant or a tree. They've been active, and so we need to shift away from them. And then what happens is, as you're experiencing the new ones through visualization or practical experience with them, you're forming these new roots. And so then as we experience those more and more, ongoing transmission, chemical and electrical signaling goes through them, and that's like fertilizer. It makes them stronger and stronger. Well, if you're practicing the new ones, visualizing or practicing, you're not practicing or visualizing the old ones. And what happens is there's no fertilizer going on them anymore, and they'll begin to weaken and go dormant over time. Now, they're always going to be there, but because you're not acting upon them or thinking or feeling them, they grow weaker and eventually become dormant, replaced by these new practices and feelings, thoughts, behaviors that you are now employing. And that's what it is. It's a gradual shift away from the old into the new. And I assure you that all of this is represented physiologically in the brain by neural pathways.
And that's actually a really good segue into my next question for you, and it comes down to addictions. Then addictions are an interesting thing because we have heard the arguments for decades, seen scientific research and all sorts of different methods. When it came down to when it comes down to the addictions, do you believe it is more chemical or more psychological components?
It's both. The really insidious part of addiction is it's a complete hostage taking, reformation, malfunctioning of the reward system. So, we have networks in our brain that are responsible for reward, and the brain needs reward in order to pursue anything. It wouldn't pursue anything without reward. Very similar to like when you're training a dog. If you want that dog to learn a new trick, you better have some treats in your pocket or you're not going to have a lot of luck. Our midbrain is very primitive, and frankly, it goes to what you were talking about earlier about negativity bias, and that is that the number one job of the brain is to survive. Nothing else comes close. If you are about to get run over by a car on your way to Saks to buy a new outfit, that brain only cares about you not getting run over by a car because its number one job is to help you survive, and so on and so forth. You'll also notice that you get joy and reward from having a good meal. If you didn't feel good after having a good meal, then you wouldn't eat. If you didn't eat, you'd die. So that's why the creator gave us reward from having a good meal and eating and enjoying being satiated. Same thing with sex. Orgasms feel good because the creator wants us to have babies so that the species can survive. And so your brain is always on this high level of focus, alert, reward around survival. Okay, so with addiction, the problem with these drugs and behavioral things that are addictive is that they deliver dopamine, reward, chemical, far in excess of anything that's normal and natural. So, a great orgasm feels good, but I'm sorry, it doesn't compete with meth. Meth will give you, 10x the dopamine surge that a great orgasm will. And so normal reward mechanisms can't compete. And so people like me that use drugs and alcohol are in this never ever land of dopamine reward, and we don't think anything else is important because nothing else gives us anywhere near that kind of reward, right? So, you're trying to get somebody off drugs and alcohol, and that's what makes it so insidious is that, we need to return ourselves that are addicts back to a normal reward level platform. And so we have to start beginning to experience reward off normal pleasures again while we're coming off a really heightened, elevated, unnaturally so reward. That's why it malfunctions it, because it takes it to a place that it was never meant to go there. Our synapses were never meant to have that level of dopamine running through them. So that's really the hard part about addiction and it's really uncomfortable physically, psychologically, and emotionally for a period of up to a year. The physical part is primarily the first 90 days, but then the emotional and psychological part continues on there for quite a while you're trying to pivot and shift into these normal reward levels over time. So addiction adds another level of complication to the matter because you're trying to reset the reward system back down to how it was meant to function.
No, that makes a lot of sense. There's a lot of contradictions in there too, though, or a lot of no, I'm not going to say contradictions. I'm sorry. It's a lot of contrast in there because, like, I can speak from a high functioning alcoholic point of view. I had some days I felt pretty damn bad after a bender. And it wasn't enough to stop me from picking up the bottle the next day, which is interesting because so you're saying that the dopamine hit or that I got off that was more than the potential offset or the consequences. Kind of like meth. I mean, we all know that people who smoke meth, their teeth fall out eventually, but the dopamine hit overrides that and hijacks that.
Yeah. So the problem is that let's just use some numbers as an example, okay? So let's say that your normal baseline is 50 for homeostasis. So like where you feel like you want to live life, just that normal, because if it was zero, like we wouldn't even get out of bed. So let's say it's 50, you have a great meal, you have an orgasm, that dopamine will take you to, and these are dopamine levels, will take you to 100. Okay, so let's say that in the best of normal life experiences, you'll go from 50 to 100, and then you'll recede back as the dopamine surge begins to fade, and you're back down to 50. Okay, so now you're doing math, and you're up to 1,000, right? And so the problem is, you surge to 1,000, and it's euphoric, and now you start coming back down. Well, you're coming back down. You think about coming from 100 down to 50, like with a normal life pleasure, and that's just a gradual increase and a gradual receding, and that doesn't really feel bad. You just go from what we think of as euphoric or feeling really good back down to normal level. But when you're up to 1,000 and you come back down, that is a crash, and you feel like shit because you've been really euphoric, and now so there's a lot of physical symptoms. Withdrawal is what we call that goes along with that deep, rapid receding of dopamine rushes. And actually, you don't even go down to 50. You start to go down lower than that, which is why you feel so crappy. And so then, your body is screaming, your body and your brain are screaming at you saying, boy, I don't like how I feel. I want that reward again. That reward was so good that I don't care what the consequences are. And that becomes a partnership between your limbic network and your frontal parietal network, the two parts of your brain. One is for reward, the limbic network, and then the frontal parietal is your executive functioning, which thinks about the consequences of things. And they're supposed to offset each other, right? Have this ego type relationship where, the limbic network always wants reward. The executive functioning part of the brain says, nah, that's not a good idea because, you're not going to be able to function tomorrow. And then they're supposed to and that's why you stop after 2 drinks typically, is because your front part of your brain tells your reward system that, we got a busy day tomorrow, I think we should stop. And so when that thing gets out of whack, or the rewards are so great that the reward system begins to not even listen to the front part of the brain, it'll do anything to stop this feeling of withdrawal. That's what causes addicts to keep using. And then the problem becomes tolerance, where because our neural pathways, the neurons involved in reward, are not meant to have this much dopamine traveling through them, they begin to numb out. And so not as much dopamine can travel through. And so you have to keep using more and more and more of the substance to get more and more and more of it to release, so that you start to feel, or you keep chasing that initial feeling. And that's where addiction becomes progressive, is because you have to keep doing more and more and more to get the same effect.
And when we're talking addictions, and when we're talking coming off of addictions, or getting over them, we talk a lot about dopamine, and that is related a lot to happiness and things, right? So by kind of reframing your mind and heading more into, I guess, that unconditional happiness level, do you find that helps in getting addictions off? I mean, if I'm not mistaken, that is kind of the premise behind Alcoholics Anonymous, and incorporating religion in a lot of cases, is that they are trying to get you to a baseline that's more happy, so you can get more of that natural dope. Is that correct?
Yeah. So dopamine is a pleasure and reward chemical that is tied to motivation, your desire to do things. Serotonin is another neurotransmitter, feel-good chemical, that is more tied to happiness, long-term well-being. you know, so the way that I look at my life now is that I don't want those spikes of pleasure, the ones that are like the quick hitters, because I had a really long trying experience with that. And sure, it was really great at the beginning, and you get these euphoric moments. The problem is they last for lesser and lesser amounts of time, and you back down to chasing it again. I now look at my life as pursuing serotonin, joy, happiness, and well being. I get so much pleasure now off of serenity and just being calm. That other life, those dopamine surges, where you're really looking for the heightened moments of pleasure, that is a really, it's a chasing lifestyle. It's a way up, way down. It's stressful. It's exhausting. It's isolating. And it begins to have these really horrible consequences. And the longer you stay in it, the worse those consequences get. And so I just, a lot of people fortunately get the message early on, and they kind of drift and shift out of that maybe naturally. And there's people like me who have to really run into a wall to get the message and have these consequences pile up to the degree that it's kind of like this mouse that's in the maze, and you keep trying to turn left and right so you can keep partaking in that dopamine lifestyle. And, along the way, you find rights and lefts, like, ways to keep doing what you're doing just in different forms to keep it going. But then at the very end, you end up at the end of the maze, and there's no way out. And that's kind of where I ended up. And so that begins the process of having to figure out, well, okay, that didn't work so well. What else is there? And that's the problem with addicts, is that that's all you've ever known. And so a lot of us sit in rehab and we're looking, at the counselors and the people that come in and speak to us, and they're all full of this different type of look in their eyes. Not the beady, like I'm jacked up on something pleasure. It's a feeling of happiness and well-being. And it's like a different look that we've never seen before. And that's serotonin. That's this warmth and joy from inside out. And that comes from, pursuing these parts of life that are joyful, that really resonate. And there are a bunch of those aspects of life that do give us this sense of joy and happiness and well-being. And we have to find those, and we have to begin to experience those for us to begin to get the chemicals off of them. Now, there is dopamine attached to that, but it's not dopamine from 50 to 1,000. It's dopamine from 50 to 100. And then you get serotonin from that. You get endorphins. You get oxytocin when you have a loving relationship. I mean, real love, real connection. The social relationships, like humans are meant to get joy from social relationships. That's why you get oxytocin when you fall in love with somebody. And again, it's all in this interest of survival, so that, we fall in love, we have sex, and we have more babies. I mean, that's what it's all meant for, but that's why we're given these chemicals. But, the key is we have to get off of the juice, the booze and the drugs, long enough to let those neural pathways that are activated for that to begin to go weaken and go dormant, while we're shifting over and experiencing these new forms of life that do deliver dopamine and serotonin, and do those enough times that the brain says, as it's weakening on the dopamine surges, it's now experiencing reward in these other ways. And you just have to stay with somebody long enough in that it begins to create these new habits.
You said some things there that struck a few different chords, and it got me thinking, in terms of AI, and you said human connection, and we need the human connection for, to those feel good. It was, serotonin and also dopamine in some case, or oxytocin. Mike, and you said that the brain doesn't know the difference. So, how dangerous is AI for that now? Because I mean, I've seen this in younger people. They prefer, and well, yeah, there's no beating around the bush. They prefer to deal with AI characters than talk to real people because the AI characters always agree with them. They're always, suggesting good things. They're never arguing. How big a risk do you think we're facing as a species?
Well, what comes to mind is two dangers. Number one is, and that's, social media. I don't want to go too far down that rabbit hole. I personally don't use social media. I'm of a much previous generation anyway, so I didn't really grow up with it and form early habits with it. But I just feel like you hear a lot about high levels of depression and anxiety amongst college students that have kind of grown up with this, and then you throw a pandemic on top. Well, first of all, on social media, you're viewing everyone else's life as perfect. You don't see the other parts of it. No one's life is perfect. Everyone's a human being. Pain is a part of everyone's life. That's what life is your relationship to various forms of pain and how you deal with it. Okay. Um, so, when we are experiencing, so when we're giving joy, feel good chemicals from actual physical social experiences with people. You may get a small dose of that, I guess, in some ways from a virtual character, but you're certainly not going to fall in love with somebody or experience oxytocin. You're not going to, that real deep, genuine connection and the feel good chemicals that go along with that. You can't do that through a box or a or virtual reality, right? That we only get that through this interpersonal connection. And so that's concerning in that, you know, if you're not partaking in that, you're missing out on that joyful experience that we're meant to have as human beings. So when we were created, God knows how many years ago, and as cavemen, like evolution didn't know that we were going to someday have all of this stuff. And so now we were designed for millions of years ago, and here we are today, and yet, and we're evolving, I guess, but we still receive the same joy and feedback from very basic things. That's why our brains are number one geared for survival and always will be. So we really lose out when we don't experience those things that are meant to give us these innate joyful pleasures. The other thing that's harmful, I think, is that, okay, so these characters never disagree with you and you can create them in any way that you want. Well, how does that really reflect life, right? And I'm sorry, but life is all about ups and downs, and you have these setbacks, and how do you pivot? How do you bounce back? Resilience is really a major part of life. And so you kind of have to, in order to get that skill, you kind of have to be out there where the setbacks happen so that you can be a full functioning member of our human race and be successful in it.
I like what you said there about you kind of have you take the ups with the downs. It's the best way to put it. And actually, you touched on another point there. Going through the pain and things. It's interesting that Michael Singer wrote specifically in the book The Untethered Soul. He wrote that the chapter that I didn't want to read when I was reading the book, I read it and I was like, what the hell are you talking about? Was the only true path to freedom is through pain. And he gave this example of the story with two dogs. And these two dogs lived in this house across from a park. And the dogs loved to run across the park and play and, you know, do things. And the city got mad and said that, your dogs are pooping over there all the time. The kids are scared. The dogs are bigger. They're not, they weren't unfriendly, but, liability, blah, blah, blah. So the owner, he gets out those shock collars, not enough to kill the dogs or hurt them seriously, but he puts one of those invisible fences in. And so the first day that's on there, both dogs go running towards that little fence. The first dog gets there, he lets out a big yip and runs all the way back to the house. And the second dog runs back to sort of the middle of the yard where he could no longer feel the tingle of the collar. The next day, the first dog just sits there on the porch, watching the kids play in the park, and sort of that sad look on his face. But the other dog sort of gets in a little commando crawl and goes to where he can just feel the tingle in the collar and sits there all day. And he does that every day until he's able to cross whenever he wants, because he's able to push through that discomfort, right? And I thought that was a really interesting example, and well, obviously it stuck with me. It just goes to show how much of our lives we're living just avoiding pain, and we're making it really inconvenient.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And the problem with that, of not pushing through it, is that you never get to experience anything different. Like people that are addicts, have to go through that pain of quitting and the withdrawals that go along with it in order to experience something else better, hopefully on the other side. And it's true of everyone, that if you're not happy with how things are going, there's fear that goes along with it, which can lead into procrastination, or it's really just freeze. But there's so much good that can happen on the other side of pain, and a lot of times it's not really pain, it's just uncertainty. Like there's this invisible fence line of uncertainty. Like you don't know the outcome, and you feel like where you are is safe, it's known. And so some of us would rather just stay there because it's quote unquote safe or known. Like we know what this pain is, and it's manageable. Like we've absorbed that, we're conditioned to it, but we don't want it to get any worse, so we don't experience anything outside of it, right? And so it's interesting that that's a good visual analogy for, I think, what a lot of people go through in their lives.
No, it's amazing what we can find out if we just have a little bit of awareness, right? But today's society isn't really geared towards that. It's been a really great conversation, George. It's really in depth. We are coming up pretty close to the time. Is there anything that you wish I would have asked but didn't ask, or anything you feel we should have covered but didn't cover today?
No, I mean, I think it was a good talk. I just would encourage people. I don't know how much of this sounded like voodoo science or whatever, but I can assure you, I was in a place where I was the guy that thought everything was black and white, results oriented all the way. Never had any time for looking at things a different way. And fortunately, this stuff works. The brain can be your partner. It sits up there, and I think a lot of us are afraid of it or don't understand it. But really, it's there to be at your service. You can design it and have it work for you and create the kind of life that you want for yourself, and it'll respond. It'll follow you along. Doesn't have to be scary. So I just want to encourage people that if they're not happy with where they're at, there is a better life out there for them, and it all starts and ends up there on top of your shoulders.
What a strong note to end the show on. Just before we go, Greg, just before we go there, George, what is the best way for our audience to reach out to you, to ask questions?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's George Haymaker, HayMaker.com. And, there's a lot more information on there about who I help, types of individuals, how I help them. And there's a link for a free 30-minute discovery call where we can just kind of shoot the breeze and figure out what's going on with you and see if we're a good fit to work together, or, if not, that's fine. But it's a free call, 30 minutes, and we can, maybe give you a little more direct insight as to what you're going through.
Excellent. Well, again, George, it's been really great having you on the show. To all our listeners, we are going to have that in the show notes as well, make it easy for you to find. And to all our listeners as well, just thank you for tuning in. And just remember, if you can't find that inspiration or motivation for yourself today, maybe just go and try and be that motivation or inspiration for someone else. And we'll see you again next time.